Do I start this not muted? That's the real question. And I feel like I didn't. I feel like I didn't, but you never know. Hey everybody, welcome to the first episode of Debate Hub. I'm excited. I hope you're excited. I've been freaking out all day. All day I've been like fiddling, messing with stuff. I don't know. And that's just my day. But yeah, welcome. This is the first episode. I'll give a brief explanation. I'm actually going to take this off because I can hear myself right now, and I'll have to fix that as we go. But I suffer. This is my life. Okay, so basically the whole idea of the show is to be able to be fair through bias. So although I may be biased to whatever we're talking about, I'm going to do my best to provide a platform that the platform itself will at least treat people fairly and as neutrally as possible. Although if you're an asshole, you're going to get treated like an asshole. I also want to say happy birthday to Philip. So shout out to Answers and Reasons Philip over there. So happy birthday to him. If you haven't seen him today, go give him a quick happy birthday. I have our lovely two guests with us today. Would you like to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, my name is KIRK WILCOX. I am a comedian, satirist. I have a YouTube channel, Twitch channel, where I focus mostly on satirizing politics, culture, political issues. Talk about philosophy and economics as well. But yeah, you can find me at KIRK WILCOX on YouTube, or you can find me on Twitch at Kirkomania, or on Twitter at KIRK WILCOX. Hello everyone, nice to meet you, and thanks for watching today.
There are also links in the description.
And I am LANDON CURT NOLL, so good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on your time zone and latitude, and perhaps even political attitude, from your friendly local astronomer. I am an astronomer. I've also been a former, I've been held political office, and I've actually been one of those politicians. And I enjoy having chats and discussions. So here we are, and we're about to commit something. We'll see what happens.
Something. All right.
And you prefer to be called Landon, right? Because if it's Kurtz versus Kirk, this might get confusing really quick if we're not enunciating our T's and K's.
Yes, if you're not using the California enunciate all your vowels and all your consonant stuff, then it could be there. So yes, I'm known by people know me by Landon Knoll, and although online I'm often as Chongo. So Twitter is at Landon Knoll, but you'll also see Chongo, and that's a long story, which only gets told over a beer in a pub. So you have to be with me.
Let's go, Landon. All right.
You have to be with me on a pub to learn what's the origin of Chongo.
I mean, that's fair. All right, so today we're going for a little bit more of...
So, anyway, so we have this so-called debate hub stuff, although being what it is, neither of us have prepared remarks.
Yeah, I kind of did a little bit of a bait and switch on everybody where I actually named the segment Debate Hub when it's open to actually debate and discussion. This is going to be a little bit more of a discussion style, especially since I just kind of want to know where you guys agree and where you don't agree. Because, I don't know, I followed both of you for a while.
You presented it as a discussion. I was like, oh, that sounds like fun. And then it was called Debate Hub. I'm like, oh, no, it's a blood sports thing. Oh, we're going to get pretty rough.
Yeah. And, I think that for me, one of the things that I mentioned I'd like to talk about that's a problem in politics today is that people approach politics like they approach sports. And if you're using U.S. football type things, it's like saying, I'm a Green Bay Packers fan and you're a Vikings fan, so you suck and I'm okay, right? That's sort of how, unfortunately, a lot of political discussion has devolved into.
Yeah.
And so I'd like to talk about that. I'd like to talk a bit about sort of what passes for political news reporting these days.
Well, why don't we start there? Political news. Yikes. So, Landon, take us off.
Understand that a lot of I think one of the things that happened in the U.S. is a big transition was that news started off as being a requirement. You were given a monopoly of a particular frequency to broadcast on, and you had to do community service. And part of the community service was to spend 5 minutes each hour reporting on what was going on, right? And somewhere along the line there was a phase transition where that notion of you having exclusivity over a channel turned into you owning the channel, and news became a profit center for which to entertain people. So sometimes they found that reporting on boring things or reporting in a boring way didn't bring in the news rating. So news departments had to make a profit. And that changed sort of the nature of what the news department was doing from a community service to a entertainment.
But well, didn't that only mostly apply to broadcast television and radio? I don't think that applied to newspapers and magazines, though, did it?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, and of course, as we moved into cable TV and digital realm, even cable TV, you had a monopoly on the cable, but when it got to whole digital stuff, the notion of you own a frequency or you're given a right to a frequency is no longer even considered. Right? It's now just news is a entertainment system, and news people are often very concerned with ratings because what does news do even now in newspapers? What is the in my opinion, news, you are the product. The customer of news are advertisers. And what news tries to do is to capture you and hold you there to present you, the viewer, as a product to the advertisers. So advertisers pay, so that's why they're very concerned about ratings, right? In my opinion. And so talking about boring stuff or spending too much time on a digital topic is not good ratings, and the customers don't like it. And you, the product, result from that.
Well, I'm not sure that the customers don't like it. I think in a lot of ways, the customers are responsible for this. A lot of people, I think this is more so with print news, especially with the advent of social media, is a lot of it is just headline driven. A lot of headlines are driven just to get extra clicks. I really hate to sound cynical about this, but I do think this is a problem. I don't know if there's a way to solve this, but yeah, it seems like a lot of people are just, the way the news is curated is they want to get the most amount of eyeballs. And unfortunately, I think what drives a lot of it is that there is a demand for a lot of garbage news and desire for stuff like, keeping up with the Kardashians, for example, or, a lot of people are saying like, oh, we're talking so much about Johnny Depp, Amber Heard. I don't mean to throw Chesh under the bus here because I know she's been covering it. But then a lot of people are complaining like, oh, we should be focusing more on the formula shortage or the war in Ukraine. And it's like, yeah, but people demand it. Like, you can't really, what are you going to do? Get mad at the people that desire more coverage for Johnny Depp and Amber Heard? So I don't know. Yeah,
and I agree with you, Kirk. Because a lot of this stuff of some of these kind of sensational news, when there's a crisis, we're repeating crises, right? Oftentimes you'll see kind of celebrity sort of thing popping up and occupying the attention, right? Because again, it's what the public does. If the public didn't fixate and hyperventilate on a news segment, then they wouldn't get the ratings. The advertiser would get mad and not give the news department money, right? So in some ways, the viewer, the product, is driving what is being presented, right? If the viewer said this is boring, right, then they'd switch off in a moment to something else. So yeah, I mean it's kind of the O.J. Simpson thing or Kardashian thing, whatever it is. Those things happen sometimes when you've had some big crisis, like say the pandemic, and that's becoming passe. Not that it's over, but that it's no longer grabbing the headlines, no longer grabbing the ratings. And so you have to find some filler.
Well, yeah, and even like with the way the pandemic has been covered, and I don't know if this has to do with what you've been saying, but like a lot of times it's sensationalized. Like you'll see like these tweets and these headlines of like, oh, LA County sees a surge in like 10,000 new cases. And it's like, well, if most of the county is vaccinated, is that really a big deal? Is this resulting in a dramatic increase in fatalities and hospitalizations? If not, then why? I know Bill Maher did a whole rant about this, about how there's just been a lot of fear mongering in the media over COVID, when a lot of it is unnecessary and it's causing a lot of more harm than good, especially in a time when vaccines are readily available and we have more treatments than we did at the start of the pandemic.
But the fear mongering is really more a matter of saying, how can we take the product, the listener, hold their attention, and keep them there so the customers, the advertisers, can feed ads to them? And the answer, you can't do it by saying, today we had a 0.06% change in the da-da-da-da, right? That doesn't do it, right? You have to say, monkeypox. I just got ourselves demonetized because I said the
way to go.
There ought to be like, oh no, my Pornhub looking channel got demonetized.
I think that was Landon's goal. He came in here complaining about my profit motive, and then he said something to immediately get us demonetized. Way to go.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. Sorry, Trademark Canada, which
he came prepared to apologize and everything.
It's story.
Yes, I don't have quite the accent. I still have that California accent. Sorry, Trademark Canada. But you have to say Trademark Canada, because unless you're Canadian, you'll write in a trademark, and who knows what
you will owe Canada a whole Canadian nickel.
Meanwhile, I'm from Michigan, right next door to Canada, and now I'm in California. It's like we switched places.
Yeah. I was in California and went to the state of Washington State.
You say rum?
State. Hell yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of problems in the media. We saw a lot of this with the way, Andrew Cuomo was covered with CNN because his brother was an anchor there, and that turned into a whole thing where they were kind of running interference for some of Andrew Cuomo's more shady tactics. And now, I think there's a lawsuit between Chris Cuomo. I think there are a lot of people who are kind of activists and went into the media, and then they shape and frame stories to kind of fit a narrative. But there is still a lot of good reporting out there, especially with the way I've been covering stuff. Times when I read the Wall Street Journal or even CNBC, even with CNBC, you would say there's definitely a liberal bias. But a lot of times when I read articles there, it's pretty decent reporting. I think too many people want to throw out the baby with the bathwater whenever they see media bias or corruption to an extent.
Yeah, because media bias says you're not feeding my personal desires for hearing what I want to hear, right? So that's called media bias by some people. But I agree with you that you have to, if you're a consumer of the news, you have to work at it. You just can't go to your 3-letter news thing, listen to the 22-minute cycle where they just keep you hooked and hyperventilating. That's sort of the cotton candy of.
I think that's what Kirk was saying when it comes to are you going to blame the listener for wanting to listen when they're given basically a carrot dangled in front of them forever, but also with the sensationalism and the fear mongering kind of product that I guess Landon's talking about.
But what sells?
I think that gets what?
I mean, isn't it what sells, right?
Yeah.
But used to be that old adage in print, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That was kind of the thing you'd put on your front page of your paper when people actually read newspapers. That was kind of the adage. Even back then, there was a little cynicism there, but you had more pages you could look at if you wanted to. But now,
definitely.
And it's something that we're still trying to figure out with the advent of social media. There's something that, Twitter, companies like Twitter, I mean, Elon Musk is buying Twitter, and I guess in the name of trying to fix a lot of this bias and corruption with social media. But this has been a long controversy with YouTube for the last 5 to 7 years. There's a lot of channels that a lot of quote unquote independent media people who relied heavily on YouTube to make money to report and give commentary suddenly saw their ad revenue shut off because advertisers suddenly got a little antsy about maybe sponsoring some segments that might have controversial views.
Or that just weren't bringing in the ratings they wanted to see. And so they liked people who were doing more edgy stuff, more what's called drama, I guess, or whatever that thing is.
Yeah.
And and understanding in the drama, when I've talked to some people about how can you do this, and they say, well, that's what gets the ratings.
You can cover a story without sensationalizing it. You can break down a situation without covering the more like dramatic parts, right? I mean, you even see this with the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp situation, where you've got some places that are sensationalize it. You've got some people that are like devil's advocating it, despite what popular or public opinion happens to be, or sometimes even despite the facts, which I think is a little bit more problematic. I don't really think there's a problem with playing devil's advocate or saying, hey, let's look at this from a different perspective. But when you're just full on lying to people, you got a different problem on your hands.
Yeah, and so it's a matter of. So I think in some ways part of the state of the news is a result of the intention of the audience. If people got turned off by
as soon as you
gossip,
made it about like advertisers, that was immediately going to like flip things.
Yeah, and that's part of the process of, I think that, and again, I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying it's a fact that news departments became profit centers, and they had to worry about the ratings much more than they did before.
Besides like maybe NPR, where they're before like the advent of broadcast television, where companies were given like certain monopolies over airwaves, was there ever a point where media institutions, whether it be the New York Times or NBC or whatever, were not driven by profit?
Probably, yeah. You're right there, but they were a department of a larger organization. So you in the U.S. you had oftentimes ABC, NBC, CBS, and the independents, right? And that broadcast channel, as part of their FCC requirements, for example, would have a news segment because they had to, and those news commentators started getting to be fairly popular.
Are you guys? I can't hear what Landon's saying.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I think.
Hold on. Is that better?
I think Kirk has been silenced.
Did I fix it? Sorry, I think that was my end.
Yeah, I missed like the last 30 seconds or whatever.
Sorry, that was me.
Sorry, yeah, way to go.
I don't have to say the TM thing. I'm Canadian.
Yes. So, but I guess we're just saying that certainly profit has been part of companies with news. But if you had a major channel like a broadcast network, like it was NBC, CBS, ABC, and the independents, the NBC channel used part of its profits to do a news segment because they were perhaps required to. I mean, it wasn't that news segment was there to drive the NBC brand. Oh, congratulations!
All right.
So back to say, but I guess you say, well, you could talk about. Sure, I gotta say. So I'm glad the audio is working well. Thank you, Josh. I'd say we could talk a little about the history of news, but I think more importantly, where we are today is a ratings game.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
it's really demoralizing to see it when people are just like blind partisan hacks, cheerleaders. One person I've seen a lot with this ever since like 2015 was the guy named Charlie Kirk. Oh no, we're bringing more Kirks and Kurts into the discussion.
Oh no.
Okay. But,
here we go.
For those who don't know, Charlie Kirk, he's the founder and head of this organization called Turning Point USA. And I've been following him for a while because Turning Point USA, they claim to be like a campus organization that claims to promote free markets, capitalism, the ideals of the American Constitution, the founding fathers, all stuff that I really like. And when I first started following Charlie Kirk, he was rather reasonable. I remember watching interviews with him saying like, yeah, I'm an evangelical Christian, but I think conservatives need to stop obsessing over religion and preaching religion to other people. But then ever since 2017, when Trump got in office, he slowly turned into like a blind cheerleader and defender of President Trump, constantly on Twitter talking about how amazing Trump is. Even wrote a book called The MAGA Doctrine, eventually became friends with the Trump family, to a point where I remember he did an interview with Ben Shapiro, and he said, it's not my job to criticize President Trump. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? Am I allowed to swear?
Yes. I
I'm
made
sorry.
I made the whole place like Pornhub. I don't know how to make this.
Although there that shit has asterisk in it, so maybe you need to put it with an asterisk.
That is only for posting it other places.
Oh, okay.
So I don't get screwed right out the gate.
Yes.
But he's like, oh,
well, you only swore. You only swore later on, right? So the algorithm.
Yeah. We gotta give it like a good 2 minutes. Yep.
Of clean stuff. So back to as you're saying with this person who had this transition to he no longer is his job as a reporter to question.
Yeah, it was disappointing to see. He said, it's not my job to criticize President Trump. And it's like, dude, you're kind of in the media and promoting like limited government. Like the government has a monopoly on retaliatory use of force. Like you should always be skeptical and critical of political leaders, especially the president of the United States, who is the commander in chief of the armed forces and is responsible for the branch that enforces our laws. You should be especially critical, even if you might like the guy. And it was just really disappointing to see him turn from a guy who was pretty good at advocating somewhat for free markets. And now, like after election Tuesday in 2020, he was like one of the, what we would call, election denialists, and like had a total meltdown that Trump was losing. He couldn't believe it. It was just disappointing to see someone that I wanted to like just go down this path of just blind cheerleading and defending for whoever was in charge of his political party.
I imagine it gets into that cult of personality type.
Yeah, situation. And that's to be fair, this I call it the sports fan analogy. Is a matter of saying, you are loyal to your home sports team and you criticize your rival because by definition they suck, but you're unwilling to say, hey, my team's screwing up, the team's not very good this year, You can't do that because a true fan doesn't do that sort of thing. And so it becomes a notion of, well, if you are the other team, then I have to criticize you because whatever you say isn't worth considering, right? And I can see it a sports thing where you're playing sports stuff. Okay, if that's what you want to do,
but over that sports ball,
political divorce. Yes, but I, on the other hand, it is. I was in Vancouver, BC, when the Vancouver team lost Stanley Cup, and there was a riot, and it's interesting to watch Canadian. Yes. And they lost, and it was interesting to watch Canadians riot. I have to say this: even though they're rioting, they still, when driving, would signal stop at a stoplight and signel, right?
But listen,
polite and driving,
Canada,
but they were.
This is Canada. This isn't Nam. There are rules. You can riot all you want, but you better be turning your signal on, and you better be like not damaging the Tim Hortons. Like this is not our rules. There is a question from the chat though, from Jack of Hearts, that asked, did Kirk go down the path of Trump supporting because he believed in it, or because he figured out that it was where the money was?
I think he's talking about Charlie Kirk, so we got to get our Kirks straight.
Yes.
That's all speculation. Maybe he genuinely had like a change of heart on his politics, because he did eventually, I remember him saying like, oh, the way to go forward is populism, nationalism, in the brand of Josh Hawley, not more of this. He's kind of abandoned like the whole platform of advocating for markets in favor of socialism. Now he's embraced culture war, populism that has become dominant on the so-called American right. Maybe it was because of money and connections with the Trump family. That's all up for speculation. Either way, even if that's the case, it's disappointing to see. If that's the reason why he changed his mind was because it made him a lot of money, and that's where the money was, that's where the fame was, then he's a sellout. And I think he should be ashamed of himself. So it's hard to say.
And to be fair, right, it's either one hand to pick on the MAGA crowd, but let's also be fair to say that the people who are who are cheerleading on let's say the opposite team side, who are watching Jon Stewart, Seth Meyers, those things, and are really into that sort of stuff, and treat anyone who is a Republican to be evil, so forth. They're just as sports minded as a teabagger MAGA, right? And so don't go there and say, well, yes, I don't do Trump, I don't do MAGA stuff. I'm smarter than they are, but I watch my so-called late night commentators to get preach to the choir because I want to have more understanding of how to be a true fan of my sports team. If you're doing that, you're just as bad.
Oh yeah, I remember Seth Meyers doing that when Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin didn't go along with some of Biden's agenda, and then Seth Meyers would say, "Oh, they're just doing the bidding of the big pharma and coal lobbies," and it's like, well, they're also in purple states, and they know. I'm guessing that they both know if they go a little too far, that they might have electoral consequences, especially in West Virginia, where Joe Manchin at this point is kind of an anomaly, and if he went too far, they're going to replace him with a Republican. They're not going to replace him with an Elizabeth Warren like Democrat.
Yeah, and I say that you might be frustrated with Senator Manchin, or you might be cheering him based upon which sports team you call a fan of. But there is a legitimate debate over the Senate filibuster and its pluses and minuses, right? And so there are people that are asking that. Now, but again, and I think you could make an argument that perhaps the Senate filibuster's days are over, but that's currently being debated in the Senate. But you talk about in terms of selling out. I would say, for example, probably the person that I think about when I think about political sellouts is Minority Leader McCarthy in the House of Representatives, U.S. Representatives, where if the Republicans gain control of the House of Representatives, he's likely to be the Speaker, and it has been his political ambition for years to become Speaker. In fact, his maiden speech to the House of Representatives, he mentioned, brought back there saying, at some point, I hope to be up there as Speaker. That's been his goal. He lost to Nolan Ryan for Speaker. And at the time he lost, he looked at, again, the Tea Party stuff and said, these folks are crazy idiots. I want nothing to do with them. And the result was the margin that they represented was the margin he lost on the speakership. And he's realized that in order for him and his party to gain control of the House, this vocal minority within that political realm has to be paid attention to. In fact, they're given extreme power beyond their number and their size, and so you see him having to pretend like these people are actually rational folks, and you see him basically duck and dodge the stuff. In his back of his mind, and he said privately, these folks are idiots, but I got to pretend because I want the Speaker, right? That's what he said. I want the Speaker. I become Speaker, and so I don't care how crazy you are. If you're supporting me, I'm going to stand up to it. And that's been a lot of problems with this. We have two major parties that are very close to each other, and that tiny margin is dominated by the screamers, the lauded force.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's the radicals that ultimately move things, and it's the moderates that kind of go along with them. And I think that's kind of a unfortunate state of our politics. I even have relatives who live in Elise Stefanik's district. I think she's third in line in the Republican Congress, the Republican House of Representatives. And they told me that a few years ago, she was not nearly as crazy as she is now, pandering to the crazy conspiracy crank elements of the American right.
Yeah.
I imagine there's a degree that kind of comes with when you're sort of in the moderate area, you're not nearly fighting for what you want as hard as the people who are trying to get something, that want something in particular. So that's why you see the extremists on one side or the other kind of pulling everybody one way, or one way, that this way, that way. Sometimes they're pushing somebody in a direction they otherwise wouldn't go in.
Especially hold the balance of power.
Right.
Then you're right. Then you're right. So how do we fix this? How do we fix? We seem to come to agreement that this is a problem. How do you fix it?
Well, I think I think most people don't really want to hear this because it requires a lot of patience. But I think ultimately the battle is philosophical, and you got to change the philosophical attitude within the culture. We need to push the culture toward more a pro-reason, pro-individualism, pro-freedom culture. I think sadly the culture kind of embraces elements of either mysticism, skepticism, and its logical conclusions, which is collectivism and statism. And, ultimately, when you look at the radical elements on both sides of the left and the right, they're kind of going toward collectivism, but just manifesting in different ways at the moment.
Yeah. And it just depends, so unless we have people who perhaps, are you saying do more critical thinking, we're going to be subjected to this sort of team-like mentality?
Yeah, I mean, I just think right now, I would guess most Americans just kind of want some element of the status quo, which is like a mixed economy, a lot of freedom, but yeah, we'll have like a strong welfare state and a regulatory state. Maybe we'll change things here or there, but it's the more consistent advocates of these premises, the more consistent advocates of statism that ultimately move things forward. And I don't think there's really... I think there might be a strong contingent of people that just kind of want to preserve the status quo, but you ultimately have to have a strong contingent of people who want to move away from statism. And in order to do that, you'd have to change the attitudes in the culture from altruistic to rational self-interest, from collectivism to individualism.
I mean, I definitely agree that there's a whole lot of this idea that the sovereign state, right? The everything is like the state. This is my state. I want my state this way. Whereas America's also at the same time trying to be a country democracy. And because they're trying to do both at the same time, it just ends up kind of being a ramshackled opposing forces with the team playing within it of the two different parties, which are sort of both doing the same thing when it comes to at least the idea of the sovereign state. Yeah.
For me, the thing that I think we should try to avoid is a thing I call hyper-nationalism and belligerent patriotism, right? And I'm using those things because it's okay to be pro your country, right? But when it becomes a nationalist thing of like, my country, right or wrong, we're the number one greatest, which is one of the things that this sort of supremacism that Americans get into too often. And then the belligerent patriotism is love it or leave it type of thing, right? That says unless you are doing this, right? And so examples of belligerent patriotism can be either unless you have an appropriate number of American flags on your truck, or unless you have a number of Black Lives Matter stickers on your business, you're not a true blah blah blah, right?
Yeah.
And so this hyper nationalism and belligerent patriotism are really bad combinations that we seem to dive into.
And they play off each other too, because the right will say, oh, you need to embrace the American right, the nationalist conservatism movement and all of its baggage because, oh, you want Antifa, you want socialism, you want what they have in Venezuela. Well, you vote with the left, but if you don't want that, then you got to accept all of our baggage. And the left does the same thing. Oh, you don't want theocratic nationalism? Well, then you have to accept all of the baggage that the left brings.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those, like, you can't pick and choose what you want. If you pick that, then it definitely the other guy, right? Where it's like Biden's whole platform was non-existent. His platform was I'm not Trump though. Like he didn't have an actual like plan.
So it gets it back to the sports team of saying, well, if your sports team is not playing very well this year, maybe you should root for another different team because it's not enjoyable to go to a game and watch them lose all the time.
Said Toronto fans literally every year. Like, are you kidding me?
Yes. So
don't get me started. I went on a whole rant about Toronto versus Tampa Bay during the playoffs this year. I hadn't watched. My mom was like, "When was the last time you watched hockey?" And I was like, "Don't worry about it. I watched 2 games and now I'm mad."
Well, by the way, I do.
I was
going to
say, doesn't the whole country get behind every any Canadian team that makes the Cup Finals?
So, okay, the funny thing about that is yes and no. So most Canadians, when it comes to hockey, recognize that all of the Canadian players are playing for an American team because we don't pay nearly as well. Yes. So one of the things that I found hilarious about Tampa Bay versus Toronto when I was getting mad at Toronto, actually I wasn't getting mad at Toronto. I was getting mad at the ref and I was getting mad at Hockey Night in Canada commentary. But either way, the person who scored on Soup, his name is Campbell. Everybody calls him Soup. The person who scored on him is from Mississauga, which is just outside of Toronto. Yes. So everybody was like half mad.
So it's one of those things. But
go ahead. Go on. No, you go on.
I say, in hockey, the thing I always say is that playing hockey in places like Florida or Arizona seems kind of unnatural, right? And so in that sense, I agree that and the wackiest part is going to a hockey game in Hawaii on the Big Island, right? Where there is snow there, but it's on top of Mauna Kea or Mauna Loa, right?
The big arena in Tampa is the only place in Florida that shows up on Google if you search for poutine. Because there's a smoked poutineery inside the arena.
Yes. So, but back to the thing, I like to watch. I'm not particularly a fan of any particular team. I like to watch well-played hockey where the refs are not over officiating and the players aren't fighting. Right? I'm a person. I don't enjoy watching a hockey fight in a stadium because that's usually a sign that the refs haven't done their job, or you've got a coach who's just pushing thugs, and you're not playing quality hockey.
Gets mad at Nobody usually gets mad at a fair game. It's usually when people think it's unfair or something unreasonable has gone on that people get upset. And you see the same thing in politics. A lot of the Republicans that I see that are angry because they think that the election was unfair. And why do they think that? Political reporting, for the most part.
Well, there is a thing that we have with some politicians, and that is their narcissistic tendencies are driving them. So I would say Trump is a person, when you watch his press conferences, when you used to hold them, and you'd ask a question about the pandemic, and he'd talk about himself and how unfair it is to him, right? Everything Trump is about Trump. And Trump has turned it into a cult of personality, and Team Trump became one of those sports teams. The Republicans, being a minority party, recognize that segment is necessary to cater to, because if they don't have them, they lose, right? And this is back to the part of the two-party system, the sports team system, the crosstown rivalry stuff. The other people suck just because. Right. So
we've got 2 super chats I'm going to jump in real quick with. Helios for 10 said, doesn't all this pandering to extremists become a positive feedback loop? We know that when you play into reactionary extremist ideals, they escalate so that today's extreme is tomorrow's norms. And then my unfinished journey for 5 said a ham sandwich would have been a better president than Trump, and Biden is a ham sandwich.
Interesting points. The better or worse is a hard thing to sort of evaluate, right? I think one of the things that is probably for Trump is more than just out of the norm is post-Trump being this narcissistic, like, sore loser, right?
Yeah.
I went through the process of seeing Al Gore lose the presidency over Supreme Court stoppage of looking at stuff going on in Florida. And even though I was kind of mad at Al Gore for saying to the senators, don't protest, don't object, he basically said, if you do, I'm not going to become president for that process. But now I sort of see the wisdom in what he did. I think the Supreme Court made the wrong ruling, but I never said Bush is not a legitimate president because why? Because he was certified as having more electoral votes, and then he swore the oath of office, and he was qualified under the Constitution to become president. Like it or not, that's what happened, right? Whereas Trump lost, right? I don't care what you are, he's a loser. But the difference is Trump is a sore loser. His narcissism, like tendencies, cannot handle the fact he lost. And so he's pushed, I think it's aptly called this big lie, because the crowd that wants back in power recognizes they think they need his help. And so they will go along with that and push this narrative of stuff. But in fact, what the problem the big lie ran into was that even though the Democrats captured the White House and barely captured 50-50 control of the Senate, they lost a lot in the state houses. And Republicans at the state level said, wait a minute, you delegitimize this election, our legislative victories get also subjected to. So there was a big pushback, and you found fairly red states resisting it must have won, must be a bad election because Trump didn't win, right? That's Trump as a narcissist acting. And so that's where I get very disappointed in the Republican Party, because they're enabling this person. And that's a sad thing. Now, if it'd been the other side of the coin, I would have been just as mad. If Biden had lost and he played this sort of game of the Republican stole election, it was very refreshing. It was very refreshing to watch the election go on in Australia. They had a major change of parties in the parliament. That was then the current prime minister had a concession speech, who then called the other guy and congratulated him on winning. He came out afterwards, had his concession speech, and the next day, the governor general, even though they don't have the full party formed, was swearing him in as prime minister. They had a rapid transition, a very smooth transition there as a result. Now, it's enough that the Murdoch press made a mistake, and they started they leaked a bunch of articles, or a bunch of articles escaped out of the newsroom, talking about how the new prime minister is doing a bad job, even though he hadn't been sworn in yet. They had a causality problem, right? But that's an example of the press in Australia, the dominated by Murdoch, pushing a narrative of this party's bad, right? That's then, and this is probably why I would say of the first world countries, Australia is probably the most corrupt first world country you will find. In part, it's debatable, but I would say that you could argue that because of
you said the name of the debate.
It's debatable, but because of the press and the way that the press would just give a total pass to their current party group for anything that happened, and I'm expecting that there was in the Labour Party, which is currently has control, or looks like they're about to get control, that the press will just start hammering them, saying all the ills, your souffle that fell in the oven is a result of bad Labour Party, and they'll push this narrative to try to get them out again. And sadly, the Australian public will buy it and will toss them out shortly after. That's the sad thing. But yeah, the level of corruption goes on there, and it's if you talk about your consuming the news, sometimes a good way to look, if you're an American, to get an interesting look at America, is to look at the press of a foreign press and how they cover America. And I'm talking about going to Zambia and look at Zambian Times reporting on American events, or going to Australia or to Chile or something, and look at a perspective that has a different market environment. You'll learn some things.
Yeah, I want to bring it back to what you were saying about I don't really know much about Australia politics, but yeah, when you want to talk about like playing for a team, one thing when I try to talk to people who try to dismiss Trump's role in fanning the flames leading up to January 6th, people like to pretend that January 6th, it was just a few hooligans. It wasn't a big deal that they stormed the Capitol and were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" and were smashing windows. And I like to say, like, well, if Bernie Sanders was the nominee and he lost, and then or say he was the incumbent, and then he was giving rallies, especially the day of, saying that his landslide election was stolen by 1% in corporate interests, and then Antifa rioted the Capitol shortly after that, I don't think they would have this this kind of evasive attitude over it. Oh, okay, you're applauding me, cool. Yeah. And I think this is what a lot of people really liked about Trump. I don't think it was maybe they liked some of his policies, but I think the most appealing thing to Trump for a lot of people on the right was that he was a so-called fighter, that he, whenever like the media treated him unfairly, he would punch back, he would tweet, he would own the libs. I don't think it was much about a principle other than owning the left. And we see a continuation of this with people like Ron DeSantis, who when Disney criticizes his education bill, he's like, okay, well, maybe we should rewrite the tax law in Florida to strip Disney of its special governing district. Or with Josh Hawley, he's like, oh, maybe we should rewrite copyright law to because Disney is going woke, and they've enjoyed a monopoly over Mickey Mouse for too long.
Yeah,
it's nothing about principle. It's about
very good point.
Yeah. To be fair, they have had copyright over Mickey Mouse for too long, and I demand he go to the public sphere. Mostly because did you guys see the announcement of the new Winnie the Pooh movie? That is a horror movie. Oh my god, my mind is a
Winnie the Pooh slasher thing. But yes, I
sorry,
would,
buddy.
If I were in Congress, I would certainly offer a bill to strip Mickey Mouse copyright, and to and you can't do it retroactively because that'd be unconstitutional. But I would do that thing to say Mickey Mouse is in the public domain. Disney, deal with it, right? We're not going to give you a monopoly, no matter what.
I don't think it would be fair to like specifically go out of your way to target Disney.
Yeah,
and if Disney wants to. Yeah, right. It would have to be across the board. And if Disney, you can't prevent Disney from potentially making an argument as to why it shouldn't go into public domain. But I just don't think anybody should buy that, because I want free Mickey Mouse stuff that people are going to make crazy things about.
But Chess, the problem is that Congress has passed special acts to extend Mickey Mouse copyright art. That's wrong, right?
Well, yeah, unless it's going to go across the board, it can't be Disney only. Like, if Trump hadn't been in office, I very, very, very much doubt that Disney would have been able to acquire the portion of Fox that they did. Now, would that mean that we would not get as good Spider-Man movies? It depends on what you think is good. I liked the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies. I just thought Spider-Man needed to be a little bit more sassy. But it's your give and take, right? Are you going to sell your soul to corporate Disney for a Spider-Man movie? Maybe. I don't know. I don't know your life.
As legislation,
It'd be one thing if Josh Hawley came out and said, look, the copyright protections, they're been extended for way too long. We got to rein it in. If he did that, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But Laura Ingraham of Fox News did a segment back in April saying, look, when Republicans take over Apple, Disney, everything's on the table, including copyright protections. And when Josh Hawley proposed this, he specifically made an issue of Disney, quote unquote, going woke. And, even if you disagree with Disney getting involved with politics, which I don't think they should, I don't don't think the state rewriting laws to punish them is the correct way to respond.
Yeah, that's
well. So the way,
that ought to be.
but I understand what I'm talking about is reversing the special extensions given to Disney on Mickey Mouse, right? That is just as wrong, right? So the copyrights over Disney characters should be just as long as current copyright law allows. Don't say we got to give it better because it's somehow a national asset or whatever the cutesy thing, right? Don't give
I think it was
special things.
Half of their crap
extended.
is also like other fairy tales that were previously in public domain that they then made into their own. But good luck trying to do the same thing they did because they're gonna strike you now.
Yeah.
Well, when it was extended in the 90s, other large media institutions like Warner Brothers were lobbying for this too, and it did go across the board. It wasn't just applied to Disney.
Yeah, if it goes across the board, then sure, but
there's a special law
all or nothing kind of thing
that gave Disney extended rights over Mickey Mouse. That's the recent. We're not talking about. We're not talking about the current change of set. They have a special exemption for reasons.
Yeah, that's the more recent one. The one in the 90s was a board wipe, whereas the one that happened recently, I think it was partially centered around the new NAFTA stuff, the Canada, Mexico, America deal that exists. Oh, sorry, NATO. New NATO, whatever the hell it's called.
I think it was the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement, which further restricted baby formula from Canada because we can't have you filthy Canadians flooding America with your baby formula.
Their maple flavored baby formula.
Which, by the way, which also that agreement explicitly excluded France, who is the fourth country in North America.
France,
right? There's a part of France in North America, and it's an island.
One of the Virgin
It's
Islands.
what is it? The Saint Michel and McCullen Islands. They're off there's part of France that is off the east coast. In fact, when U.S. and Canada come to agreement on fishing rights, France goes and says, "Yeah, but not us," and so they basically do a big fishing troll out of the mouth of the St. Lawrence River because that's part of France. There is it's not a colony. There's actually part of France.
Few disputed areas also along the border between Canada and America that kind of go back and forth, and they kind of debate and contrast. And sometimes there's like a part of, I think there's like one of the like a small island that follows like along a river it's an American island, but they have to cross the Canadian border because the Canadian border dips down, but this island is American, so they have to like go. It's like there's a couple little spots along the no touching zone that are basically like that.
So it's off the coast of Newfoundland, and McCullen, Saint Pierre, L'Anglade are actually part of France. And they so they're the fourth country which is part of North America, assuming you don't think that Greenland's part of North America. If it is, then the fifth country. But yes, and they even though I believe in those islands the Canadian dollar is the common currency.
Oh, probably if it's France related, then it would work easier with Canadian currency than it would with American currency. In my opinion, that's based on absolutely nothing besides the fact that we have a French part. It's fine.
yes, but yes, go and look up Saint Pierre and Miquelon current French territories in North America, and you'll see information about that. But anyway, but yes, France complained that they were not part of that trade agreement because technically they're one of the people there, but.
How do you guys feel about America actually owing France like a bunch of money?
Do we?
Back from like in American independence, where they got a whole ton of help from France and then never paid them.
Oh well, I mean, there is that argument that the French French kings supported the revolution, and when it came time for the French monarchy to get support back, they were kind of abandoned. But understand in international politics, there are no marriages. There's just current convenience, and that one rivalry turns, decades later to best buds, right? That's international relations are very fluid, and alliances change.
Huh? Yeah, I mean, that's not wrong.
Yeah. Well, I do think it is a responsibility for the federal government to establish certain trade deals and relations, and we should try our best to honor those trade deals, because if we don't, then who's going to trust us going into the future?
There was a whole ton of tariffs during Trump's administration that went down.
Oh, yeah.
How do you feel?
Tariffs are terrible. I mean, before the income tax, I know they were like the main revenue for raising taxes, which I think was an appropriate tax because, again, at the time, the federal government was mainly, before the welfare and regulatory state, its main operation was, or one of its main operations was establishing international trade deals. So if you're going to import goods from other countries, yeah, you're probably going to have to pay some sort of duty to maintain the operations of like a navy to protect the trade routes and to pay a government to establish those trade deals in the first place. But Trump imposed tariffs for the sake of protecting American jobs and whatnot. He further tried to justify it as, sticking it to China. But again, as you mentioned, a lot of that stuff was imposed on goods from countries like Canada, which is not the same as China. That all that does is all the people who pay those taxes are American citizens. It drives up the cost for goods in America, especially manufacturers that rely on imported goods. So it's just a disaster. A lot of economists have written about this, that when you try to impose protectionist tariffs, it has the opposite effect because you destroy American jobs, because a lot of manufacturers do rely on imported labor or imported goods. And we're seeing this with Canada, namely with the baby formula shortage, but also lumber shortages, which have driven up the cost of building new housing, which I think has played a role in the increased prices on housing in the United States.
Very good points. And as I say, tariffs in general have a very negative effect on everything. So they're not. It's rare that a tariff is a good positive thing. And tariffs will give you temporary relief, much like giving an alcoholic a drink will give them a temporary relief over the craving. Right? It is, and so tariffs. I know now there are times where tariffs become necessary. But often, if you look at the reason why they're necessary, is because you've had previous problems before, and you're just kind of, kicking the can down the road. And so having trade zones where you try to have most favored nation status and try to minimize the tariffs is important. But NAFTA, as an example, the trade thing, particularly with Canada, had problems.
Whatever it's called.
But I'm talking about NAFTA at the time. I didn't.
Right. Sorry, I got all my acronyms confused. Don't mind me. I'm just a wee little goblin.
So one of the things that NAFTA did, I mentioned, is that it is virtually impossible to find a Canadian wine in the United States, other than maybe Enniskillen ice wine as a dessert wine on top. It is nigh impossible. I found 2 restaurants with notable wine lists where they actually carry wine from Canada in there, even though there's some great wines there.
Why would you want to buy Canadian wine? Are you trying to put American wine manufacturers out of work? What's wrong with you?
Yeah,
just because our wine is better and more affordable.
And in fact, one of
and maple flavored.
That part of what free trade agreements did was allow certain industries to screw the other side. Right. And so part of NAFTA was all these agreements saying the American wine industry can go and screw Canadian wines because they don't want competition coming in, as an example. And lumber was a similar sort of thing. So those trade deals come down to who was able to bribe their elected officials in the form of campaign contributions to get legislation in NAFTA to say, we protect our blob. Right. And that's oftentimes, some of the trade agreements where that has positive effects of trying to minimize tariffs also legalize protectionism. and that's a
Yeah.
generally protectionism is another form of tariffs. You just don't pay it in a specific tax, in my opinion.
Yeah, often there are favors for large corporations in the United States, and we're seeing this in the dairy industry now. Scott Linscomb just wrote a really good piece about this pertaining to the baby formula shortage. I know this has also been an issue with the sugar industry for decades, where there are high tariffs on international sugar players, and then we also subsidize sugar manufacturers in the United States, which just raises the price of sugar for American consumers. And including manufacturers like Hershey, who has to pay more for manufacturing costs to make candy bars.
But speaking of candy, here's another example on that line. A lot of hard candies, that you'll buy in the United States come from Canada, and the reason why they come from Canada is Canada buys sugar from Cuba, but America says Cuba's bad because Castro bad, and so we can't have any Cuban sugar in there. But Canada says, sure, sell it to us. And in order to create those hard candies, you can't do it well with sugar beet or corn oil. You need the hard cane sugar from stuff. And so Canada buys cane sugar from Cuba by the shiploads and produces those candies you see at the restaurant, the little hard the things with the peppermint stuff. And that's why. And in fact, you'll find that people who try to say, well, maybe we shouldn't do all this trade embargo over Cuba. Maybe we shouldn't be so anti-Castro anymore. And several things come up. Well, people who want to play to the Electoral College votes of Florida recognize that there's a minority in that group that says, don't you dare change the status quo. Also, Canadians who come down will lobby to try to prevent that from happening, because they recognize that if America started importing cane sugar from Cuba by the boatloads, the Canadian hard candy industry would collapse.
There's what do you guys think Biden has even done about any of these tariff and trade changes that happened during the Trump administration?
Biden has continued Trump's Buy America policy and has maintained a lot of these tariffs. That's one thing that Trump and Biden actually have in common that I don't think is good.
Because his looking at campaign contributions recognizes those same things that drove support of protectionist policies. Those and these are folks who truly understand how politics work. They don't say, "Oh, your team sucks. I'm a this fan." Those are industries that know they contribute to both sides of the aisle because they recognize that the power goes back and forth. And so they didn't sit there and say, "Oh, Biden sucks because the election was stolen." They say Biden's the current person whose party we need to contribute to in order to gain more protectionism.
Yeah. And I just tying this back to what I said earlier about like just changing the mindset of, the American culture. I think when you talk about tariffs and protection, ultimately what this boils back down to is altruism and collectivism. Why do we need tariffs? Because your fellow American might need a job that needs to be protected, and you owe it to him to pay more for a good imported. Like, apply this to video games. Like, we have an American company, Microsoft, that makes video games like Xbox, Halo, and whatnot. But it's like, I like Nintendo. I want to play Mario Kart. So what? Are you going to impose a tariff on me? Do I have to pay more, or so that you can, hopefully incentivize me to keep some software engineer in Washington State employed? Fuck that. I want to play Paper Mario.
Well, it's imposing an expectation onto the consumer that ought to be something that is the company itself has to handle and deal with. Because if they can't make a product that is something that people want, then they don't deserve to be in business. And if they can't afford to pay their employees, they don't deserve to be in business. So if you want to compete with Nintendo, then you have to compete with Nintendo on a fair playing field, and not have the government stepping in to impose onto, like, unfairly onto other countries, nor onto their. Well, I mean, I guess it would be the government would be imposing onto the companies, like outside of American companies, which is then imposing that onto the consumer.
And the international trade stuff really impacts you, the person listening, in ways you may not even quite understand in terms of your cost of living and other things. And And it's sometimes easier to see it in smaller markets, such as, for example, in Australia. Try to buy a GPU in Australia, and you will find you're paying almost 2 to 3 times the price.
Any kind of tech in Australia, the price is out the wazoo.
Yeah, and you want to be a nice hostess gift, show up with it. But of course, if Australian Customs catches you bring it in, then they'll fine you and give you a whole bunch of tariff stuff. So it's difficult, even though technically some of those chips are being manufactured in Taiwan and it's closer. This is an example of the fact that the international market for goods is so distorted. Now, this isn't to say they're bad actors, right? There are countries doing dumping and other things that also happen, but in general, import tariffs and taxes and trade deals are really codifying a bad situation.
Well, it's like getting in additional things into a bill. So it's like, hey, listen, we're going to make this trade deal with you, but we want also this other unrelated stuff. So like you see the same thing in Congress, like, hey, we all agree about this thing, but also.
Yeah.
And here's the thing.
When they were discussing when they were discussing the infrastructure bill, you had like Democrats saying that like paid maternity leave is infrastructure. So it's like, oh, that was one of the consequences of a national freeway system was eventually we would pay mothers like 3 months to stay home. Really? Yeah,
and this is whole part of the thing about saying, well, they can't get the Senate filibuster eliminated, so they can't use a majority, so they find their excuses to get stuff done. Why? Because that's where the contributions are going, right? Understand that members of Congress spend a non-trivial number of hours not working for your constituent, but in raising money. They spend most of their time, a significant amount of time, not in the Senate building, but on the building on the side where they go across to go and call and raise money, right? And in fact, I think part of the problem is that campaign contributions so dominate our politicians across the spectrum that unless you're going to be a one-term person, you are spending a good chunk of your time in office trying to stay in office. And so when you had things like Citizens United stuff where they gave the notion that a corporation's contributions were somehow free speech, this is a problem. Instead, having places where countries have publicly financed campaign sets where you have a limited campaign window, and people who qualify for the ballot have a certain amount of money to spend, right? The problem with campaign contributions, let's call them what they are, bribes, right? When you give money to a member of Congress, you are bribing that person in order to try to get their ways. You don't send money to members of Congress who don't do what you want to do. You do it to influence them. And so this bribery system we have needs to be cut off. And the best way to do it is to say, you have an election cycle, which is a certain number of weeks, not this 2+ year fiasco that we go through, but 2+ weeks. And here again here's a big problem with limited campaign contributions. If you said that you can only have, let's say in political office, you say your campaign spending limits to $1 per voter, let's say, or something like that. The problem that would case is that you have too many demands chasing too few members, right? They like the fact that various groups like the fact that they can bribe their senators without limits for that reason. So if you limited the ability of a campaign to spend, and who's going to object to that? And here's the big thing.
Well,
where does all this billions of dollars go to? But here, let me just say this last thing. Where does the billions of dollars go to? And the answer is they don't go to the politicians. The billions of dollars that go into campaigns go to the media.
Don't they go to super PACs though? Well, I think they eventually go to the media because then you pay for like to run ads and whatnot, right?
And so Canada, and Chess, how long in Canada was your election?
Not long.
It's a couple weeks.
Like, blink and you miss it. Like, there's not, like, once in a while you'll see, like, paid for by the government of Canada ads, which are generally just a basic PSA. And then for maybe a week, you'll see like a handful of like the Liberal Party ad and the Ontario Party ad, which is usually just slamming the other party, but it's never longer than like, there are rules.
But that's the thing. And the reason is they limit the amount of money you can spend. And so on a campaign. And so this is the problem, is that the people who object to it are who receives the money. Yes, you give it to the politician, but the politician turns around, unless they're crook and just stick it in their pocket, and use it to buy media time.
But let's say like Donald Trump's running. Let's say Donald Trump's running for president, and I want to raise a bunch of money because I made a documentary criticizing Donald Trump and everything that's wrong. Should I raise a bunch of money so that I could buy ad time to play it before the election to better educate? Should I have that right?
Well, you would say that in terms of free enterprise, if you want to make a movie, raise money, make the movie, and distribute it as you want.
Yeah, but then like maybe pay CNN and Fox News to air it on their channel once leading up to the election. Should that be?
I mean, if you want to buy airtime, sure, right? If now,
well, that's what Citizens United was about.
But it really was about giving corporations the ability to say you can't limit their speech, right? That first of all, the notion that
Citizens United, I think they were a nonprofit group, if I'm recalling correctly. They made a movie about Hillary Clinton, and I think they aired it or something, and then they had to sue like the finance election committee or whatever, and then it got heard by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided that this was a violation of their First Amendment rights, that they should have the right to try to broadcast a documentary as much as possible. Maybe I'm getting the details wrong, but yeah, a consequence
was yes. And I got some of the details wrong too. But I think part of the problem is that the amount of money and the amount of time spent in campaigns means that your elected officials are spending a natural amount of their time trying to get reelected. And money, you have a nearly infinite sink of money to try to bribe them to do something. And that's how you get
a bit of an issue between like an individual versus a corporation, or versus like who that individual potentially is. If you've got somebody who's a bad actor, then yeah, you run into problems. So what I would probably think at the very least would be that yes, an individual, if they wanted to make a YouTube movie, like, or they want to pay YouTube Red or whatever, and then have that distributed and get it to go viral or whatever, and say it's pro-Trump, anti-Trump, it doesn't really matter. Then as an individual, they'd be fine, even if they did crowdfund it, provided that individual is not like Ivanka Trump or something like that. Or at least if she did that, at least it was clear that she made it or something.
Well, what if it's a corporation that's being unfairly targeted by certain politicians, like we saw here in California with Uber and Lyft and the AB5 law, or with what we see in big tech? Like, what if they want to make a movie defending themselves because they're being attacked by certain politicians? They say, oh, if you reelect this guy, Twitter might get destroyed, Google might get destroyed, or whatever.
I think it's absolutely fair for them to be able to put out and talk about something that's happening to them specifically. But then I think it would be better to phrase it, and maybe this is just my PR brain, you'd be better off to phrase it as a point of view of, hey, here's what happened to us, here's what this specific thing happened, here's the evidence of that specific thing, what could this mean for other companies as well? And then kind of go from that angle, and I think you'd probably end up being in a clear, rather than making a hyper pro, like a hit piece, basically.
Yeah.
I will clarify this. I do think, there's a lot of problems with lobbyists and corporations influencing politicians and whatnot. That definitely is a problem. My solution would be, I think this is a consequence of the mixed economy where you turn the politics into a game of pressure group warfare where the who's who, not just corporations, we're talking activist groups, nonprofits, unions and whatnot. I think the best way to get rid of that is to shrink government to a very limited scope of protecting individual rights and property rights, to where people have no incentive to lobby local government, state government, or federal government for favors and kickbacks and whatnot.
Yeah. So what if you limited a politician's ability to spend money on a campaign? Right, to say that you have a limited amount you can spend on a campaign and a limited time. So, for example, if the presidential campaign was a 3-month season, let's say, and you have you're limited to $1 per voter in the previous previous election, right, type of thing, and that kind of limiting the market, limited on the supply side, means that ideas have to compete for the politician's attention, rather than just say throw more money at it and see who throws the most money speaks the loudest, right? And again, I have no problem with people and groups getting together, exercising free speech and having discourse. It's the politicians who have to spend most of their time trying to raise money to stay in office that becomes a problem. And again, I don't, people say special interest. I have no problem with special interest. If you are a group of people who are concerned with redwood trees or telescopes or oranges, be my guest, form a group and educate people and speak your mind. Great, right? That's not.
It's in the back pockets of Big Orange.
Tropicana's out here.
I did mention telescopes too, so I got that astronomy thing in there. But it's a matter. It's that they spend their time, their effort, trying to get reelected rather than trying to do their job, and the campaigns become dominant. So you're sick of political ads? Well, guess what? Unlimited money going to campaigns then hits the airways, and you see the result of this unlimited money being blasted at yourself, as opposed to in most countries in the world, campaigns are limited. Now, people finagle, and there'll be people who will cheat. That's welcome to mankind, and so forth. How that happens. And I apologize for saying that. If that you're so woke and you say mankind, screw you, because I don't play those sort of games.
Landon's out here like, I'm not playing semantics with you. We're having an adult conversation. Wee woo, wee woo. It's the first episode. I'm already demonetized. I'm gonna get canceled. It's over.
And are we sure this is not?
Go ahead.
Are we sure this isn't overblown? Because I remember when Mike Bloomberg ran for president a couple years ago, he was mocked for spending $900 million on his campaign, and he got one electoral vote or whatever from Guam.
Oh yes, I mean you're right that you can't buy an election effectively, especially if you've got a bad product. Just like a company can't come out with a crappy car and try to dominate the market for a long time. Now you might overinflate your car. I'm not mentioning Tesla, and to beyond stuff where it shouldn't be worth $1 trillion. But if you can get away with it, fine. It's a matter of saying that it's when your elected official starts raising money the day they win the election, right? And if they lose the election, they'll probably start raising money if they want to get back in office for that sort of thing. They spend the time concerned with, I've got to raise more money than the other folks. And also what happens inside the legislative process, right? You might ask yourself, someone like why would somebody like a Bernie Sanders or a Ted Cruz raise the amount of money they raise? They raise far more money than they spend on the campaign. Why to do that? Well, here's what happens in the political thing. People raise money to gain power. So back when I was in the state, lived in the state of California, there was a gentleman named Willie Brown who who was Speaker of the Assembly, lived in a safe seat where he would typically get 70+% or more of the electorate. But he raised many, many millions of dollars. And how he became Speaker, how he became dominated was, let's say there's a bill, and the bill has to do with regulating how rice watering happens in the Delta, and you don't want to go along with the bill. And Brown, let's say, wants you to vote for it. He'll come to you and say, "Hey, Kirk, I need you to vote for this bill." And you say, "I don't want to. My constituents don't want that." They say, "Well, that's really a shame because I might spend $20,000 to primary you. That is, give $20,000 to somebody who doesn't like you, so you have to work against them and run unopposed in a primary. So you can choose to vote for this bill, or I'll make sure that your money, that money goes to this person to run for you in a primary." And worse than that, if they're really, if they're the component, and worse than that, if they're clever, what politicians do when they, again, why does a politician raise much more money than they need to get themselves reelected? Because they then loan that money to other people to influence process. And do you know what? You know what those loans do? What you can do with those loans? You can give it to an organization, they don't pay you back, and then you can write it off as a bad loan and get a tax deduction. So I was told when I did my thing,
ways to fill the swamp. I heard that like Donald Trump Jr.'s book was like a lot of the sales were inflated by like selling it to super PACs to give out his favors and whatnot.
I mean, when I ran as elected official,
they've been trying to play the same trick on Joe Manchin for years for not going along with everything the Democrats do, and he still survives.
In what world is getting a book written by Donald Trump Jr. a benefit, though? Like,
I don't know. It's called free speech. It's called free, but understand, when I ran in my office, my campaign, I loaned my campaign money, right? And so I leaned on money to run my campaign. And then when the campaign is over, the campaign committee closed down, and those poor schmucks didn't pay me back. And tax accountant said, now you can declare that as a bad loan. But I refused to do that because that effectively was taxpayer funding of my campaign, right? People think that they don't do campaign taxpayer funding. Yes, they do. Political loans get written off as bad debt because the organization they loan it to goes away, doesn't pay it back, and you can take it right off. So politicians who want to be very influential will raise much more money than they need, and you pick your person, whether it's a Sarah Abrams or it is a Joe Manchin or a Ted Cruz or whoever it is, and you'll find they raise a huge amount of money because that campaign chest, some of it goes to try to get them elected or reelected, but some of it goes to loans, influence.
Do you remember when Ted Cruz was trying to raise money by like selling autographed Dr. Seuss books when Dr. Seuss decided they were going to like stop printing 6 of their books?
I do remember that. Yeah. Yep.
Culture war.
My favorite thing is every time I do one of these kind of episodes and I'm talking with Americans, half of the time people get their mind blown when I'm like, Ted Cruz is Canadian, right?
He Cuban.
Right? He wasn't gonna get anywhere politically in Canada with his dumb nonsense. Like this is Canada, there are rules.
Yes, on the other hand, Canada, you had Mad Max and you had Stephen Harper, so
we did have Stephen Harper. Fair enough.
And Bret the Hitman Hart.
I mean, Jean Chrétien was always a good one.
Yes. And for the record, I did not like Pierre Trudeau.
Oh.
I thought Pierre Trudeau's actions were unforgivable, and it took me a while to because I was feared. I tend to dislike dynasties, so when his son came up to try to impose, that bothers me. And I am not a fan of monarchies. I'm not a fan of this hereditary power stuff.
You're not a big fan of our Prime Minister Centerfold. There are people asked, they did polls to be like, well, why did you vote for Trudeau? And there was like a legitimate portion, like a measurable percentage that said they thought he was hot.
Yes. And this has been a problem in Canada, is that Canada's political process has become presidentialized. That used to be a really negative term. But when I was involved in doing polling back, in about 20 years ago, I've stopped it because it's just too frustrating. But we would do test polling in Canada. And one of the interesting things we found in Canada is that a significant number of Canadians could not tell you who they voted for. Right? You ask a Canadian, who did you vote for? And they might say, oh, I voted for Trudeau. Oh, you're in Trudeau's riding? Oh, no. I'm in downtown Vancouver, British Columbia. Well, who do you vote for? Oh, I voted for the member who is part of Trudeau's party, right?
I voted
They can
red.
tell you who the leader of the party and the color, but they can't tell you who they voted for.
There's a really unfortunate thing in Canada where our local elections are tied too much to who's riding in the party, and from there you get so like you get your local governments and your local districts that then, depending on the number of seats those districts get locally, will depend on how many seats they end up with in Congress. Which is really problematic.
I want to get this straight. Yeah. Are you not allowed to? Is like voting split ticket really difficult in Canada?
Yeah. It's not like if you want to. So like a lot of the times, what a lot of Canadians struggle with is that their local politics, they want somebody who's not in the party they want to be the prime minister, or not in the party that they want to be the provincial leader. So you might want to vote for a local conservative in your city or in your district, but you don't want Doug Ford representing Ontario, and you don't necessarily want liberal or conservative government being the overarching government. So there's it gets sticky, it's problematic, nobody likes it. I don't know. There's been talk about electoral change for a long time and nothing ever happens. Shocking, I know.
And it is.
You guys have never heard of that in America, right?
It is a big problem for our electoral college stuff. But again, you look at like how France elects their president. You think electoral college is broken. Study how someone becomes president of France. That's a wacky system in of itself. So we're not the only ones that have weird stuff. But back to the thing about that I think is problem in Canada is that voters vote for the party leader, and you ask them. They don't sit there and say, well, which representative in my area is doing the better job? Which person would be a better representative for my area?
There's something that people do.
No. If that person's a wrong party, they have to suck, right?
There's something that people do in Canada called tactical voting, where they basically vote for a party that they don't like on purpose to screw over the other party. So that way, the party that they do want, the next election, they can vote for them. So that way they're doing better.
Exactly.
It's weird.
So let me say that this is back to Americans who do this. Oh, I don't like the election, I'm going to move to Canada. If you say that, you don't understand Canada. Canada is probably as screwed up politically as America is.
Oh yeah.
Just in different ways, and they're polite about it.
Sometimes.
Sometimes.
Yeah, people are always full of shit when they say that.
Yes. So don't think the other side of the fence is greener. Blah, blah, I'm going to move to blah, blah, blah.
Well, a lot of the times when you hear somebody say, oh, I'm going to move to X country because I don't like this X like the politic situation or whatever's going on. Like, oh, I'm moving out of America. I don't like Roe v. Wade. It's like, okay, where are you going? I'm going to go to Canada.
Yeah. And from what I know, most countries have more strict immigration policies than the United States as well.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, American immigration or Canadian immigration policy is strict but open. So it's strict in what it's strict in what its rules are. However, it seems to be a little bit easier, and it's complicated, but it's not. You can go to a free place or email a free place, and they will walk you through it and tell you how to do it. They'll be like, "Here, listen, this is what you need to do. This is the papers you need." Da 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 da.
Yeah, and but different countries have various rules. Canada is easy to get pets into. So if you're overseas and you have a pet and you want to come to the U.S., all the quarantine stuff is quite difficult. But Canada makes it easy to actually go there. They actually will give you a pet passport, which then makes it easier to get certification to come into the U.S. with your pet.
So we are at the hour and a half mark. So I'm gonna grab some of the questions, and we're gonna let Kirk start because I know how Landon gets. He's gonna go. he just debunked and just like brought up the entire, tore down the whole money conspiracy theory in politics. So we're gonna give Kirk a chance.
Yeah.
Yeah, go for it, Kirk.
I'm gonna start at just because it's you and I think it's funny. I want to hear our guest definitions of a mega pint.
A mega pint?
Yes.
16 ounces?
16 ounces. So that would be, can you show me like how that big would be? In a mug? Like a big sippy mug from 7-Eleven?
Well, this is from Las Vegas. I'm guessing it'd be around here, I guess. I actually don't know how big this mug is, to be honest.
So I was doing the math while I was out the other night for my mom's birthday, and we did the math of what a mega pint would be using mega, the mathematical term, and it turns out it'd be like one of those big aging barrels. About that.
Yes. Yeah, where pint's one of those quaint British terms of 16 ounces. And ostensibly, mega pint should be 16 million ounces, but that's not what it is. It's a term of art or a colloquialism.
Andrew Stoll.
Oh, we got the math genius here. He should do. He can explain it.
That's why I asked you, just because I wanted to tease you a little bit. Andrew asked, how about the lies of the Democrats of the Trump and Russia, the spying on Trump by the FBI? You guys have any thoughts on that?
I never got too into the weeds on the whole Russia. Like, I don't think Trump was really backed by Russia. I don't think it was a Russia. Maybe he has like ties to Russia, but I don't think like he was like a plant or whatever. I don't know. I never really bought it.
Sensationalized, you thought?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there is generally in intelligence services they've been concerned with Russian actions inside the United States for a while, and so people who have ties to Russia get more attention by intelligence services. So that's possible that was the case. The notion of conspiracy is kind of different. However, it wouldn't surprise me, given Trump's narcissism, that when he has private conversations with Putin, it's about trying to get a Trump hotel in Moscow for himself. That would be like in his mind the way he works.
Accidental conspiracy against the United States of America via megalomania.
Wasn't he like trying to get Zelensky to withhold, to give him dirt on Hunter Biden in exchange, but he was like threatening to withhold aid to Ukraine at the time or something?
There was no tu quo quo.
Yes. But yes, that was that thing. And for that, I refer you to the Houch impeachment team's arguments in the Senate on Trump's first impeachment.
Did you guys
that would be pretty
find that, since we were talking about this earlier, that the media representation of what was going on in whatever was connected between Trump and Russia was far more problematic than informative?
Yeah, because in order to grab you, the product, attention, they had to sensationalize it.
Yeah, fair.
And so it's hard to try to determine what the facts were. What do you think, Kirk?
Well, no, like I said, I never really took the deep dive into the whole Russiagate, what was it, impeachment thing. I never really got too into the weeds on that one, and it looks like he didn't get impeached. So I guess the court, the justice rested on that one.
So a slight correction, Kirk. I don't really mind, having been somebody who's actually impeached a office holder and tried and convicted her. Trump was impeached. That's what the House did.
But he wasn't convicted.
Trump was acquitted by the Senate. Was acquitted
Yes.
by the Senate. And so I mentioned that the arguments presented in the Senate trial, and I said I didn't say just pick both sides, but look at the arguments in the Senate trial for that thing, and that could give you, I think, a more factual basis of what the issue was about. Yes, Trump was not removed from office because 2/3 of the senators did not vote guilty.
Now, on the other hand, I did think he should have been convicted for the second impeachment, and he didn't. So I think so. Here I am, kind of undermining myself because the Senate rested on that one too.
I agree with you. I would have been, as a senator, I would have been mixed minds on the first impeachment charges, especially since I think there were other charges that could have been more significant brought forward on that first impeachment thing. The second time, I think it was a case of that, and I do believe it was quite constitutional for Trump to have been impeached and tried after he left office. There's precedents for that.
Yeah.
In other cases, and I would have voted to convict. I'd also then voted to have the second phase, which is denial from office, because I believe I am not hot up on insurrectionists, right? That insurrection is one of those things that's right down there next to piracy and the monarchy. Right? It's the scum of the earth stuff, and that being insurrectionists being the Confederacy. And my ancestors who have participated in that great act of treason, to when a group of people in Seattle and Capitol Hill declared that area to be independent, right?
The Chaz.
Yes. I would have cracked heads there as well. I mean, when you decide that you're going to go and go independent of stuff, you lose a lot of stuff, particularly my support. So I view Chaz people and I view the January 6th rioters in the same level of contempt.
And bringing it back
Chaz
to the media,
was back to Seattle, and that was so natural versus local is a different thing. But go ahead.
With the media kind of glorifying the Chaz when it happened, you could say that may have paved the road for people on the right to say, well, if it was okay for them to do it in the Chaz and riot and establish their own community and riot against government buildings because they thought that like there was all this injustice going on, this was the only way to respond, then maybe it's okay for us to do it. I'm not saying it's okay, but I think this is another, bringing it back to we need more reason and adherence to principles and always condemn political violence when whether it's the Chaz or January 6th.
A more solid philosophy, what you're saying, between the expectation of our elected officials as well as what the philosophy of the media ought to be at, and even potentially business.
Well said, and I think that. In fact, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and her wacko stuff was citing moves like Chaz, saying, "Oh, the rioters were probably Chaz Antifa type people going into the House." We use this as an excuse. Of course, she's one of those people who speaks Politburo, and Politburo is a old Soviet term, which a process of their saying, "I will lie to you. I know I'll lie to you. You know I'm lying, but I'm really trolling you, right?" So if you go to Putin and say, "You declared war on Ukraine," he'll say, "No, we didn't. You invaded Ukraine." "No, I didn't." You go, "What do you mean?" Everyone knows. Okay, and when you do that, he's won. This Politburo type thing that the Soviets and Russians do with very good effect. You just don't play the game. You don't feed the troll, right? And so Marjorie Taylor Greene is sitting there when she looks at media and just does that Politburo type things. She pulls the page out of this old Soviet thing, and she'll broadly lie. And if you're
but she's owning the libs.
I like the one of that. What's that guy? There was some governor giving a speech, and there's this one guy with a mullet and like a dirty tank top or a really dirty white t-shirt, and he's like, "The Biden administration is stealing the election. The Biden administration is stealing their election. They're trying to silence you. They won't let us speak." But nobody stops him. They just let him scream himself out, and then he just has to awkwardly walk away. And then the governor's just like, "Anyway, so."
Yeah.
doesn't
Okay,
even
other
address
questions.
the guy. Okay, so
Other
we got
questions.
one from Sean that says, is it time to get rid of money in politics as well as a full Control-Alt-Delete of our current elected officials to get some sanity back in politics?
I mean, the current politicians were elected in by the people. So if you got rid of them and then had new elections, the people would probably install probably equally as corrupt, if not worse, politics. You know, you want to talk about term limits. I think the lack of term limits may in some ways be a blessing in disguise. When you look at like Pelosi, yeah, I know she's been in Congress since the Stone Age, but when you look at like her challengers from the Democratic Party, they're a lot crazier than she is.
Yeah. Now, you know, I've discussed in California the Reset Initiative, which basically would say that all current office holders are ineligible to run for any office after their term ends, right? And so just say a whole reset and say, if you're an elected official at whatever level the state controls, because you can't control the federal stuff, that at the end of your term, your career as a politician is over. Right, you are ineligible. So it's because the problem in like in legislative is that you can be local council member for a couple of terms, and then go to county and go a couple of terms, and then go to the state and then go between the state assembly and the state senate, blah blah blah. And you can try to do a let's say state controller, then you can bounce back and forth and make a career out of it, right? And so the notion of saying that first of all, all current office holders, their career ends at the end of their term, and they're ineligible to hold a public office in the state of California again, and then put a lifetime cap of, let's say, 16 years or 20 years of service. Now, the problem is you get new people who make mistakes, and so that gets a problem if you have a whole new group of people. And that's why the initiative of saying letting till the end of their term and then having new people come in is a better way to do it. But limiting someone's term so that they're a volunteer rather than a career is perhaps something interesting. At least at the local to state level, that's probably a better thing. Federal is a different matter.
I imagine you run into I imagine no matter what, you're going to run into a little bit of trouble when it's a matter of somebody seeking out power, period.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I feel like almost ideally you would want to have some kind of passive testing that like you would have to have like a council. This is one of the things I don't like in Canada. I would like to see change is instead of having a singular person that you put in charge of like, this is our Minister of Defense. This is our Minister of Education. What you have instead is you have a handful of people that are a council that talk about education. There are a council that talk about, and then they present to what would be the prime minister or the president at the time.
Yeah.
So at least then you could end up with something, you could have a requirement. Like, let's say you have a minimum of 5 people or a maximum of 5 people and a minimum of 3 or something like that. And you have to have one from the opposition, one from the minority, one from your cabinet, and then 2 others.
Yes.
Right. And then
so you can pick a majority of your friends, but you also have that counter
and
right on the other side.
But also like they have to have like you have to have at least one, like these other 2, although they can be from your side, have to have an education in that field. And maybe these guys don't change as often as these 3 guys do when there's a holdover or something like that. But that stuff like that might be able to mitigate some of that as soon as you got somebody searching for power. But I don't know.
That would be an interesting thing. So to take it away from like what we call a secretary of education or a secretary of the interior to a committee of the interior, and say on that committee, the party and majority can have the majority of members, but there has to be minority members on that committee. So that if the interior group is doing something, the other folks can say, hey, wait a minute.
Yeah, in Canada we have
they can get away with it.
Something called the opposition. And so that's basically the party with the most amount of votes after the majority.
Yeah, but the shadow minister is there to sit on the opposite front bench and ask embarrassing questions, which the other side ignores. And the speaker then says, no, they answered your question, you just didn't like the question. So, that's one of the things that's useless in Parliament is question time, because you could sit there and say, Madam Speaker, is it not true the Prime Minister is not only screwing goats, but does not consent of the goats? And the Prime Minister gets up and says, my honorable member talks about goats. However, I will remind this Parliament that party decimated the ability of goat herders to raise goats in Canada. And this government's committed to restoring the supremacy of Canadian goats to the market.
How do we have more goats if I don't have sex with them?
That passes as parliamentary questions in most parliaments. I'm not making this up. So the other thing I mentioned in money is that one of the things that happens sometimes at local and state levels is that you have a pension, right? That you're qualified for a pension, and when you your pension typically in California was 2% of 55, which means that at 55 years age, you get 2% of your highest salary for each year of service. So even though the city council thing I had paid like $900 a month for stuff, what it's supposed to do was to give $15,000 to a assembly member or a Senate member, and they come back to the land and say, thank you very much for the contribution. Is there anything I can do to help? And say, yeah, I'd like to be on the commission to study potatoes. Say, great. I'll consider that, appoint you to the commission. Commission is a salary of $90,000 a year, and that's my highest salary. So now my pension has just jumped up because I paid for it. Right? That's a thing that happens in the States in many often. So resetting it and saying, no, you served for 16 years. We thank you for your service. Time to do something else. The citizen as a government person rather than the career politician. That's what I'd like to see.
I kind of like the idea. I kind of like the idea of a politician making a whole bunch of changes and then being forced to go back into the regular working class in the situation that they just finished creating.
Yeah. I was shocked people because I refused to take the pension because I thought it was essentially a dishonest process. So.
Well, aren't there I've seen speculation for years that they're expecting a lot of these pensions in big cities, especially in California, and I think even in Illinois, these are gonna cause crises because I don't think they're sustainable long term. So they're
they don't have the
raise
money
taxes.
to do that. Yeah. And the notion of the pension at your highest salary means that you essentially what's called top it off, right? You go to a Quango and you find at the end of your career a really expensive Quango that you might meet 4 times a year, get a or maybe even meet for a quarter or two, but it's because your highest salary, that becomes your new pension rate, and years of service, it just is.
Man, I don't know. I live in the generation of what's a pension? What's retirement? What are you even talking about?
Hey, you're supposed to start yourself Roth IRA, 401k. And now they're talking about Social Security by the administration's own admission is expected to decline by what's the proper word? I forget. But there's expected to start losing money by 2033.
Yeah, but for the record, I do not draw on a pension. I do not make use of my health care, right? Because politicians have pensions and they have national health care. And because citizens don't have that,
I'm going to run for politics, and my whole ticket's just going to say, Landon said so.
But anyway, other questions.
Yeah, I got a question from Rose, and this one's beyond my scope of understanding, so I'm not entirely sure what they're asking, but you guys might know better than I do. So I'm just going to read it off. Wish me luck. Any opinions about the Johnson Amendment? 501c3s can't endorse or oppose political candidates.
Oh, yes. Do you know, Kirk, this is a thing where, for example, a church is not supposed to endorse a politician, that there's supposed to be that separation set, that their 501c3 status means that they're not politically supposed to say this person is God-fearing, but they don't say God says you must vote this way. I think, isn't that what we're talking about?
It's weird because when I think Johnson Amendment, I think there's like one pertaining to the FDA, and I think that was the first one that came to mind. I think it was the one that made like efficacy standards mandatory before getting new drugs approved, which like increased the cost of getting new drugs approved and is stalled in. Anyway, that's a whole other issue. I don't really have a strong feeling on that one, whether or not nonprofits, 501. I don't really have a strong opinion on this. Maybe it's good that they don't, because they're supposed to be nonprofit and they're supposed to be focused on whether it's a charity, church, or some activist committee. They're supposed to be focused on what they're doing. They're not supposed to be getting involved in direct electoral politics. Maybe like some of them may impact politics by being an advocacy group, but they can't like give money or give endorsements, because that would make corruption even worse.
So let me read from the Wikipedia thing that I think is accurate. It says the Johnson Amendment is a provision of the U.S. tax code since '54 that prohibits all 501c3 nonprofit organizations from endorsing or opposing political candidates. The section organizations, the most common type are nonprofit in the United States, are ranging from charitable contributions to universities to churches. The amendment was named from then Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas, who introduced it as a draft in '54. 21st century, some politicians, including President Trump, have sought to repeal the provision, arguing it restricts free speech rights of churches and other religious groups. Their efforts have been criticized because churches have fewer reporting requirements than other nonprofit organizations, and because it would effectively make political contributions tax deductible, right? So I would say if I have the problem of churches being tax deductible, right? I would say if you remove the tax deductible status of churches, then let them be political, right? But because they're tax exempt, and churches can do a very bad thing in the local tax base, because oftentimes local taxes, like property taxes, are not allowed to put on church. You could put a church in a spot, and all of a sudden that community loses if property tax is going towards property-based services like sewer, water stuff. Churches are a negative drain, so they become subsidized. And so I think the Johnson Amendment was an attempt to try to say, hey, if you're getting this thing, you can't turn around and endorse or oppose candidates.
Yeah.
So that's the fact.
So wait a minute. How are they subsidy? Because I think a subsidy is when you tax one party or citizen, you tax people, and then you give that money to I think that's a subsidy. I don't think getting exempted from taxes. And I think there was an understanding, from my understanding of the situation, is the founding fathers wanted to try to separate church and state as much as possible. And I think in the one of the English civil wars during the 17th century, it was over the government of England taxing certain churches. So yeah, I kind of like that churches are not taxed. I get why people take issue with that. Maybe it's not fair. They don't like that. They don't pay property taxes, but I think that probably discourages them from getting too involved politically in direct electoral politics. So that I don't really mind.
So I even though if you take away the Johnson Amendment, I would also then take away their tax exempt status as well, and say, have them be any kind of organization, because Johnson Amendment doesn't apply to a corporation, right? And corporations are taxes. So why not say, okay, if a church wants to endorse or oppose politicians, they renounce their tax exempt status and become taxable, just like a corporation. Perhaps.
I mean, it's probably something I should probably think more about. I don't really have a strong opinion on this. I didn't even know about, I knew that nonprofits were not allowed to get directly involved, but I never really read much into the amendment that made that. So
I know that there's been a push in Canada to start dealing with, so we have public schools and we have Catholic schools. And the Catholic schools are actually funded by public money and private money. So they get money from churches and they get money from the government to do what they're doing. And there's been talk about changing that over. Now they still have to follow the criteria. Like we have a base criteria. If you're not following that criteria, you're not a school anymore, basically. But they there's been talk about kind of shifting that around and making changes to that to be like, hey, listen, you get one or the other. That we can't be giving money to religious organizations from a political position. So I don't know if they're going to get rid of it entirely, but that's one of the reasons why if you ever go to school in Canada or look at any of the high schools and stuff, the Catholic schools are always super nice looking. Like super nice, super like everything's like up to date, newest equipment. They've got like, you want cameras, you got cameras. They also have limitations on not allowing people who are Catholic or not Catholic. So I know in America it's very, very far more specific. Like you have to be ordained and you have to, or not ordained, you have to have an ordained priest to like write a letter for your family so you can get into the school. That's not quite how it works up here because they're taking public.
And of course, to say the Canadian schools also, Catholic schools in Canada also had a mission to do in the Indigenous cultures. And there are people alive today who can tell you about priests and nuns who are alive today and the extraordinary abuse that they've been given because essentially the Catholic people would beat them if they spoke in their native language or didn't. As I remember, this gentleman I talked about the fact that while he is of the Cree Nation. He has really psychological problems of trying to express anything relating to his culture because of the abuse he received as a student in a Catholic school, which was state supported. And he talked about this priest who would beat him saying, speak white, whenever he would even pronounce a name, a Canadian name that had to be Indigenous, in the Indigenous way, not the Anglo way. This priest would beat him. And so he has just this psychological trauma. And by the way, that priest is alive today and would normally be brought up for child abuse. But this was a case where Canada funded schools to essentially beat the indigeneity out of people in their drive. It's a sad state of affairs that happened in Canada. And this is not like things a century ago. This is like there are people alive today that are victims or abusers, right? There are priests and nuns who, if there was a hell they belong in, who are gross abusers of children. I'm not talking about the sex stuff that sometimes priests do. But people who say you have to be a white Canadian, you cannot be Indigenous, because they thought that all that Indigenous stuff, they were saving them. And by the way, this
some
guy
crusade level shit.
This guy who would beat his response, according to this guy, when confronted was, I was trying to save your soul, and if the stripes on your back was the cost of saving your soul, they were worth it. And the guy's alive today, right? And he hasn't not prosecuted. So
I think I mean, I don't think that's still happening. I'm just saying, like a school that is found to beat kids should probably be shut down. But as far as education goes, I think public education in America has been a disaster, and we should be moving toward privatizing it completely. And that's a response to what I'm seeing in the chat.
Yeah. I think that there's something to be said for a little bit of a column A, a little bit of column B. I think it would be interesting to see sort of like what I think me and Kirk talked about this last time he was on, and I was saying that there's a style that Sweden does where they have privatized schools that are run by corporations, but they are funded by the government. But they're not funded directly by the government. The government allots a certain amount of money that is given to the people, that is given to the parents, and then the parents decide where their kids go, and then they give their voucher to the school. So that way they're not competing for government money. The schools and the private companies that run these schools are competing for your money, your choice, your decision, which is a way, way better way of doing it. And it allows it to be privatized, but also allows it to still be regulated in a fair and reasonable manner.
Yeah. And this whole thing of First Nation status and the treatment at schools, is a current sore point. I know that the Canadian government has made apologies, but to some extent, those apologies are maybe nice, but those people who are live, who perpetrated those crimes, those who are victims of crimes, that damage is still there. So sorry for.
Hold on, I did not say. So someone in the chat saying that they were physically abused in Catholic school. Well, let me say I'm sorry that happened to you, but I didn't say that it's not happening. I think I asked, is that still happening? Because I don't know what goes on in the Canadian Catholic school system. And if it is still happening, those schools should be shut down. I think I said that.
I think Kirk's more what he was getting at was like, this is no longer an institution, like allowed institutionally, versus like a situation that is like,
I sure hope it is.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because in Canada, there was a policy to have Indigenous children sent to these so-called schools to be reformed and culturalized. That was actually the government's policy to essentially make them Canadian.
It happened in America also, yeah.
So that again, and I'm not talking about the priest abuse scandal. That's a different scandal. Let's talk about the government having done this sort of thing. So, as I say, it is a complicated problem.
Perhaps at some point we can come back and have a whole nother discussion with whoever is interested in having the discussion about reparations, what is appropriate, and like how do you decide that?
Wow.
Because that's a sticky conversation. Yeah. And I feel bad like trying to like tacking something like that onto the end of what is a more general
cliffhanger.
I know, right?
Yeah.
But I also
other questions?
No, that actually gets about to the end. That is at the 2-hour mark as well. So I am willing to wrap us up real quick. So if you guys give me one moment, I'm going to run through my spiel. Next video coming up is actually going to be Landon and Manya, and that will be tomorrow. And we're going to talk about volcanoes. So anything you want to know about volcanoes, that will be your one-stop shop for anything you want to know about volcanoes. So you need to weaponize volcanoes against somebody. You need to build an evil layer inside volcanoes. This is where you need to come. As well as we got a double header tomorrow. The free thought profit. I wrote it down wrong. I wrote process for some reason. Free thought profit are coming on to talk to us about the Atheist Alliance International, because it seems like there's been a little bit of corruption going on inside their electoral process, as well as potentially inside their tax situation. So I guess they've been confronting them for a little while. So we're going to go through that, go through what they know, go through what they found, as well as kind of issue a challenge towards them to potentially come on and, give their side at a later date. Saturday, I'm going to be talking about Amber Heard and Johnny Depp because it's the closing statements. I keep having people yelling at me to do live reaction to this stuff. So that's happening on Friday.
Why don't you talk about the issues that actually matter?
I think violence towards men matters. Kirk.
It is.
I'll be violent towards you if you question me again.
Yeah, Johnny Depp, he's the one that deserves reparations, if we're talking about reparations.
Yeah, really.
I am somebody who has not followed the trial. I have no idea. I treat it much like some of the other online drama that happens online. It's just with celebrities. Yeah. I realize there's some issues there, but it's not something I follow. So I have no.
So Lana's not going to be joining us for that, but that's not going to be Debate Hub. The other two are Debate Hub. That one's not going to be Debate Hub. That's going to be just me doing my thing, talking about that nonsense and reacting to some of that, looking at some of the argumentation that's used, whether this is a good argument, whether this is a bad argument, whether blah 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 blah. And then. Right after that, which Landon might want to join, and Kirk, you are also invited if you so desire, there will be the grand opening of the Unnamed Tavern, which is basically just a big hangout, drink, have snacks, bring whatever topic you feel like you want to have, because that will also be on Saturday, probably at about 9 p.m. Eastern time. DM me on Twitter, leave a comment, or like if you want to schedule your own one of these kinds of conversations, debates, or discussions. This is an open forum idea. The idea is that you can kind of bring whatever. There are a few things that I'm going to be like, nuff off, but I'll just tell you. So find me, leave me a comment, whatever, tell me how to get in contact with you, and we can set up more stuff. Landon and Kirk, what do you guys have going on?
Kirk, go ahead.
I plan on doing a stream the next 2 days. I think tomorrow I'm going to be talking about Robert Reich's appearance on The Simpsons and some other issues in the current events right now. That's what I got planned.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Robert Reich is an interesting character. I'll just put it that way.
He's a total goof, is what he is.
He has some things to say that you can react to. Let me put it that way.
The politest thing ever. Thanks, Landon.
But yeah, so pay attention. By the way, and you should pay attention to. I guess on this section to Kirk's.
Oh yeah, by the way, you can find me. Thing. Yeah, you can find me on Twitch at Kirkomania, YouTube at Kirk Wilcox, or on Twitter at Kirk Wilcox if you want to follow Kirkomania.
Links in the description.
Yes.
Thank you.
And so follow it because he's got some interesting content. You check out his YouTube thing for some of his video stuff on there. He's as you say, he's somebody who's articulate, and when you agree or disagree, you might actually be entertained. So
Landon doesn't talk to just anybody.
So for me, I'm Landon Curt Noll. I'm still working on the International Objectivist C Code contest, doing a lot of code for that sort of thing. So that's occupying my time. My YouTube channel is still on hold. I had a producer who got COVID and then got other medical stuff, but he's coming back out. So he's doing a better job that way. But I'll eventually get around to it. But I would say for right now, I'm at Landon Noll on Twitter, although I don't use Twitter that much because other than it's sort of almost like a write-only media because it's Twitter. But then I do have a Discord server, Our Favorite Universe, and I put a link that is good for the next 7 days where you can join the Our Favorite Universe there. In that thing, you'll have there's a science news thing, extensive science news stuff. So you talk about things relating to the Voyager probe, what's going on in the sun, or something related to black holes or volcano stuff. Lots of cool stuff on that science news channel. There's also cooking and eating. Those that have been in Chester have seen some of my cooking and eating sprees where I put in there, but there's a lot more cooking and eating in that section. There's medical news, which again, it's things where I try to vet. I try to do journalism where you look for multiple sources rather than just post the latest meme. So you'll see medical news there that has been
curated. Calling out meme culture now. God damn.
Fans of history, a lot of history stuff that it's interesting history that's there. I just did for something on some ancient civilizations they found in the U.S. and or to the history of Lamborghini and how that thing come forward. Disaster news is a lot of droughts and fire stuff, and of course there's newsfeed. And the newsfeed is stuff where I try to triangulate to find multiple sources and come up with things. It's certainly been dominated by a lot of stuff in Ukraine, but I've been trying to avoid the pure propaganda and give you more informative stuff. So that link is good for 7 days. If you join, then I'll give you membership, and you can follow that area as well.
All right. Thank you guys both for coming. This has been a lot of fun. I think this was really successful first episode. Nobody got super duper mad. It was a grand old time. Last super chat we got is who stole the cookie from the cookie jar?
The globalist elite stole the cookie from the cookie jar.
And we're ending on that. Goodbye, everybody.
Why didn't they get the cookie?